Welcome back to Learning PHP. Now in today's tutorial we're going to be looking at the data types within PHP. Now there's essentially 10 data types within PHP which are broken up into 3 categories. These categories are scalar, compound and special. Now there's a full list of all the different types of data types in the PHP manual, which there is a link at the bottom of this slide, and I will also leave a link in the description box down below. There will also be a link to these slides as well in the description box on the YouTube channel. So let's first start with the scalar data type category. Now in scalar data types, you can define them simply as having a single element or having a single element field. And this simply just means that there is only one value associated to these data types. Now the first scalar data type that we have is a Boolean. This is a very primitive data type that only has essentially one of two values, either 0 or 1, true or false, or on or off, essentially. This is the smallest data type that you're ever going to encounter because it can only, like I said, have one value, and that value can only ever have one of two outcomes. The next scalar data type that we're going to look at is an integer. Now, I'm stating that this is signed. If you've watched any of my learning Solidity tutorials, you'll notice I used unsigned integers quite a lot. Now, the simple difference is a signed integer can have positive and negative values. A unsigned integer can only have positive values, and the difference is in the sort of storage of the integer. The most significant bit is the indicator of whether the value is positive or negative. So that is pretty much an integer in a nutshell. I'm not going to go into any more details. There is a little bit more in a more technical aspect, but again, I won't really cover that. The next thing we have is a float or double, which in essence is simply a floating point number. Now, floating point number is something that you would ideally use for anything mathematical or maybe some geometry or something like that. I do like to point out you should not use a floating point or floating point number for any financial system. Just because it supports decimal places opposed from an integer, it is not the same as a decimal value. A decimal value is a very precise value, whereas a floating point number is an imprecise value. So you do get levels of unpredictability with it. So I would never write a financial system using floats or doubles. And essentially the final scalar data type is a string. Now a string in essence in PHP is simply a char array. A char is the smallest denomination of an integer, which is 1 byte and contains essentially 8 bits, which has a variance of 256. So you can have 0 to 256 in the range of combinations. This usually represents a character. So for instance, I can't remember what it is, I think it may be 42 or 36 or something, is the value of A, and then every sequential value after that is B, C, D, E, F, and then uppercase A, uppercase B, and so forth and so forth. In other programming languages, a string is treated as an object where you can actually call functions off the string itself and basically manipulate it in that manner, and you'll find that in things such as Java and JavaScript. PHP does not permit that level of functionality and treats it very similar to how C treats a string or a char array. But again, I'll show you a little bit more about that as we go into this tutorial. So now we've covered scalar data types, let's move on to compound data types. Compound is essentially a little bit of the polar opposite of scalar, whereas scalar has a single field or single element value, whereas compound elements contain multiple parts or multiple values. Now the first example of this is an array. Now an array is an ordered map within PHP. This is also referred to in other programming languages as a dictionary, or simply stated a key pair value data store. Now it can be treated as a zero index as well, which essentially a zero index is, say you have 10 numbers in a row. These can be accessed by calling them sequentially from a zero based index. So if you have 10 values, your indexes run from 0 to 9. You can't have the 10th because that's an out of bounds array or an out of bounds reference. But in PHP's world, you can also have like I say, a key pair value sort of structure where your keys can be integers or strings. I believe they're permitted to have other data types, but I'm not 100% sure with that one. So your first value, instead of being 0, could be A, and your second value could be C, and so forth. I'll show you an example of this in the tutorial in the later part of this tutorial. The next compound data type you have is an object, which is simply a representation of a class or something that contains both properties and attributes. Similar to an array, things can be referenced in a key pair value sort of mechanism. The biggest difference is how they're referenced, and also the fact that an object can also contain functionality. An array can contain callbacks, which is the next thing we'll go on to, but it's treated in a little bit of a different sort of mechanism. Callback is simply just a reference to a function. So for instance, if you define a function within PHP, you can use a callback method to reference it rather than having to execute the function directly. You can simply state execute this function after you finish doing some processing or so forth. The next thing that we're going to have is iterable. Now, essentially, iterable or an iterator just simply means a data storage mechanism that you can traverse. Now, an array and an object in PHP by default are both traversable. So what this means is, even though you don't have this zero index sequence as a standard array in PHP, you have your key pair value sort of structure, you can still iterate over it in like any way that you would with a zero index. So instead of a for statement where you'd have for my starting point, my end point, and then how you increment, you could just simply state in PHP, for each element in this I want to get the individual values, and that what essentially makes it iterable. And that in a nutshell is the compound data types. Now the final data types that we have are the special data types. Now essentially these are just types of reference. You have a resource, which is just a reference to an external resource, which for instance that could be something like MySQL or Memcache or something along those lines, where you're just basically stating I want access to this library through this resource rather than passing it in an object, which is quite clunky and so forth. And then you finally have a null, which is, in my eyes, well, in theory it's a variable with no value, but in my eyes it's a reference that doesn't point to anything. Now there might be a bit of debate around that, but that's just how I look at it. And then in essence those are all the data types that PHP supports. Now I'm going to only look at essentially 7 of these. I'm going to ignore the resource, the iterator or the iterable, and callable. Those are things I'd cover later on in separate tutorials. So like I say, we just want to cover the basics of boolean, integer, float, string, array, object, and null. So if you remember in the last tutorial we had a Docker container which basically gave us a browser. So this is the Docker container. I've also created another project. This is tutorial 2. It runs on the same mechanism, so I just simply ran composer Docker Compose up, which has then just created my Docker container, which I can now access in a very simple manner, like so forth. So now this is my Docker container running. This is my index file. As you can see, it's blank, it doesn't do anything. So let's start looking at the different types of data types. So first let's start with the scalars, the booleans. Now this is very simple. You can either have a true or a false. That's it. The way you'd use this essentially is in like if statements. I will cover statements and so forth in a later tutorial, but what I simply mean by this is an if statement can contain must contain a true or a positive or negative value in the basically the statement part of the condition, or sorry, in the condition of the statement. So this basically indicates whether the following block of code will be executed or not. And to give you an example of that, you could simply have if true, and then inside that this will always run. And then if you did this the sort of counterpart to that, if false, this will never be run. And that in essence is your true and your positive and negative outlooks on if statements. So the next thing that we're going to look at is integers. Now integers can have one of several values. It can have 1, 2, 3. It could have negative 1, 2, 3, because again it's signed, so it supports negative values. You can have a hexadecimal value of an integer, so OX1, which is just simply the value of 1. You can also have OB1 as well, which is the binary value of 1. this is essentially all an integer is in PHP. There's nothing fancy about it. You then go on to your floating point numbers or your doubles, where you can have decimal values. So for instance, you can have a floating point number of 1.1. You can also have a negative value of this as well, negative 1.1. You can also have exponents in this as well. So exponent is essentially just a mathematical representation of a number. So you can have like 1e minus 1. Or anything along those lines, and essentially those are what your floating point numbers are. Now, if I'm correct as well, your floating point numbers also do permit the use of something like that. So you don't have to have the leading 0, if I'm correct. I have to just check if that's actually thrown there. I don't believe it will. It wasn't, so that is fine. And the next data type is a string. Now, essentially a string can be defined as one of, I think it's 4 ways. I'm only going to cover 3 of them. You can define a string by single quotes, you can define a string by double quotes, or you can define a string by using here docs. Now, I can never remember the here docs syntax. I think it's EOT, then your string, and then to close it, it's EOT again. Now, essentially with here docs, it's key to note that you must have the EOT on a new line with no spaces before it. So if you do that, if you noticed, everything below me now is green because that is all part of the string. If I do that, that basically terminates the string. This allows you to basically have sort of, basically, if you wanted a single quotes or double quotes, this would be a great way of using that. Personally, I will discourage the use of here docs. It is terrible and it's hard to read, so I would severely not use it. Now, what's the difference, you're probably asking, between the double quote and the single quote? Single quotes are an explicit string, and what I mean by that is in PHP, to define a variable, you simply state $my variable. And now this variable, let's just say it's true. In PHP, if I were to copy and paste my variable, paste it into that, and echo that out to the actual browser, you'll see $my variable, because it's just taking the explicit value of the string. And basically PHP does no interpretation or processing of that string whatsoever. If, on the other hand, I were to use echo double quotes my variable, it won't actually print out the same thing. It's going to print out 1. Now, the reason it does that is because anything in double quotes, it processes through looking for things such as variables to basically replace with the variable equivalent. It can either be defined by $my variable, or it can be defined by open, close curly braces, and then contain the variable as well. So that will also display your variable. Now, those are basically the 3 different mechanisms to store a string. The next thing we'll look at is an array. Now, I did basically state that there's you can use arrays in a couple of different ways. You can use the 0 index, or you can use the key pair value. Now, to start with the 0 index, you can define an array using one of 2 mechanisms. You can simply define an array by open close braces, very similar to JavaScript, or you can define an array with a function call, just simply stating array. And every parameter passed into this is an element in the array in that sequential order. So let's just take, for example, our array here. We're going to use a very simple 0 index, so start with 4, 5, and then 25. So if I wanted to access the value of that, it's 0. If I wanted to access the value of that, it's 1. And if I want to access the value of that, it's 2. So to give you an example of how you'd access that, you'd simply say value, my array, and then simply access the values by simply saying my array, open close curly braces, and then if I want to access 25, I just simply state 2. So if I echo that out, comment that line out up there, it should basically print out 25, like so. Now, another way to basically define an array in PHP is with the curly braces and using our key pair value system. So if I use my array like a map, I can just simply say map array. It doesn't matter what you call this. This is simply just how you define a variable within PHP. I can then call it, I can simply then define my array, so similar to before, so 4, 5, and 25. And this I can just simply say first, second, and last. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm simply binding the values to strings. Now, it doesn't matter if these are single quote or double quote, actually, you can use whatever. And what does matter is the use of the equal to, greater than, because all I'm saying is make sure that this value is pointing at this value here. And to access that, very similar to how you'd access the zero index, I could simply state map array first. Or actually, probably best if I just use last. And if I echo that out, it will also print 25. If I want to print out 4, just swap that to first, and that's how you use an array. And that is basically the whole concept of an array in PHP. Now, there's a lot of other functionality you could use, very similar to strings. There's other functionality there, but I'm not going to dive into that too much at the moment either. Now, an object is very similar to an array. There is a couple of ways you can actually define an object. You can define an object by simply stating new std class, which is a pre-built-in class to the PHP interpreter, which basically allows you to create a very simple class. So let's just call this my class, or let's just probably better just call this my object. And then I can access attributes of this object, similar to how you access objects of an array, but a slightly different syntax. So my object, instead of the open close braces, what we can do is simply say dash greater than, and then let's just say first is equal to 100. And then obviously I can access that value in the same sort of mechanism. So if I wanted to echo that out, echo first value, that should print out 100. With an object as well, you can also make calls to functions. So for instance, if you wanted to make a function call, my func, and call it like that, that will throw a PHP error because my func is not defined. There's two other ways that you can actually instantiate an object other than just simply stating my object new standard class. You can define a class for it to instantiate. So if you wanted to make a function call, let's just say my class, and it contains the function, so public function my func. I'll go through classes properly in a later tutorial, and then return my, and let's say my func value. So if I were now to basically create an instance of my class, I'd simply just state my class is equal to a new instance of my class. Now there's a couple of ways of instantiating that. You can have the open and close braces if you need to. I only say you need that is if you're passing in parameters such as like that. But because I'm not passing in any parameters, I can just simply leave it without open and close braces. And from here I can echo out the call to my class, and then simply my func. So if I echo that out, it should simply say my func value, which is the value of this string that I'm returning. The final way to instantiate a class, if you want to subvert the whole sort of instantiation method, you can simply define a class by simply doing this: object open close braces null. What I'm simply doing is creating a null, and I'm casting it as an object. That is basically a little hacky way to subvert the use of the constructor subroutine when an object's instantiated, which is essentially what the call new does. But again, that's probably a little bit complicated and a little bit unnecessary for these tutorials. So as I've just exampled, null is just simply a way of defining a variable with no value. So what I'm going to do is say no value and equal to null. So what can I do with this? Now, if you, for instance, didn't want to assign a value to this, I can just check to see if the value of no value is set with a function call to what's known as isSet. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to var dump, which will basically dump the value of a variable to the browser, or to at least the HTTP server, which will relay that onto the browser. So var dump no value first, which you should see is null. Now what I can simply do is check to see if it's set. Now because the value is null, this should return false because the value is not set. Now, if I were to set this as, for instance, false, it would return true, regardless of whether the value itself is actually set as anything positive. The value, regardless, is not equal to null. That's pretty much what that checks to see if it's a null reference or not. If you wanted to evaluate that in a different way, you can do simply an empty function call, which will basically say, is it set and does it contain a value that isn't 0 or false? Now, in this case, this will return true because it is empty. If you were to call this null as well, it will also return true because, again, it's still empty. Now, that's essentially what I'll cover in today's tutorial. I think I've covered pretty much all the basics in regards to variables. In the next tutorial, I might look at either standard statements. In fact, that's probably the best way to go next, is to just do some standard PHP statements. So you have your, actually I was probably going to see that well. So you probably have your very basic ifs, switches, loops, and so forth, and that's pretty much what I'll cover in the next tutorial. Now, I hope you found this useful, apart from the last bit where you probably couldn't see the little bit of text being written here due to my head. You can access all the code from the GitHub repository as per usual. If you do have any feedback or comments, please leave them in the description box down below. Any feedback is great, and if you found this useful, hit the thumbs up and I will continue doing these. Now, for people who are concerned, I'm still doing Solidity tutorials. I wanted to do a tutorial in regards to integrating smart contracts in with PHP, but a lot of the feedback I got from the Java tutorials were, these are great tutorials, but I don't really know Java and it's hard to follow along. So what I'm trying to do is create a foundation for the next set of tutorials where I'll go into looking at PHP and interacting with smart contracts. But I want to start, let's get people up and going with the basics of PHP first. So either way, there we have it, and I'm going to call it a day there. I hope you found this useful, and like always, I will catch you next time.